Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's hearing. As always, I'm joined by my fellow members of the panel, Ms. Istefan and Mr. Akbor.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
And today we're going to hear from another witness from BRE, Mr. Tony Baker. And I think the next step is to check that Mr. Baker is there and that he can hear me and see me. Good morning, Mr. Baker.
Good morning. I can hear you and see you, although the screen is not on full screen at the moment.
Right, well, we'll deal with that straight away. If you look at the top right-hand corner of your screen, you may have a button which says View.
Okay, yeah, got that.
And if you press that, it'll offer you full screen.
Okay, yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Very good. Now, you should have on the screen in front of you the words of the affirmation, which I understand you're willing to make.
Yeah.
Has that come up?
Yeah.
Very good. Could I ask you then, please, to make the affirmation by reading the words on the screen?
I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. Now, there are one or two small matters we have to deal with before you actually start answering questions. Can I ask you, please, to confirm that you are alone in the room from which you're giving your evidence?
I am alone, yes.
Thank you. Can you confirm that you have no documents or other materials with you?
I have no documents.
Or anything else that might be?
Materials, no.
No, good, thank you. And can you confirm that your mobile phone is in another room and that you don't have any other electronic device with you that's capable of receiving messages?
I can confirm that mobile phone and other implements and equipment is in another room.
Very good, thank you very much. Now, you may like to know that your legal representatives are following the hearing. They're in the virtual hearing room and can follow the evidence. They have the ability to intervene if they think it urgently necessary. But apart from that, I've asked them to keep the microphones and cameras switched off, and we have another method by which they can contact our counsel if they think something needs to be picked up. All right, but they are there looking after your position. I hope we're not going to have any problems with sound or vision. If we do, we'll have a short break while the technicians iron them out. We're going to have a short break partway through the morning and the afternoon. The morning break will come at around 11:15. And I might as well mention this now in case I forget later on. It's very important that once you've started giving your evidence, you don't discuss your evidence or anything to do with it with anyone else, including, of course, your lawyers. All right?
Understood.
I will try to remember to remind you of that when we get to the breaks, but if I forget to do so, please bear it in mind. Now, is there anything you'd like to raise or questions you'd like to ask before we start?
No, thank you.
Right, well, if you're ready to go, then I'll invite Miss Grange to put some questions to you. Yes, Miss Grange.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Mr. Baker, good morning. Thank you very much for attending the inquiry today. It's very much appreciated. If you have any difficulty understanding anything that I'm asking you in the course of the questions, please just ask me to repeat the question or put the point in a different way. If you feel you need a break at any point, please let us know. And can you try and keep your voice up? And also don't just nod or shake your head so that the transcribers get a clear record of your evidence. Now, you've made 3 witness statements to the inquiry. I just want to take you through those. If we could go to your first witness statement, that's at BRE 405774. This is your first witness statement. And if we go on and look at page 26, we can see that it's dated the 12th of July 2019. And is that your signature?
Yes, it is, yeah.
And have you read that statement recently?
I have.
And are the contents of that statement true?
They are, yes.
And if we go now to your second statement, that's at BRE 3032261. Here we have that second witness statement. And if we look on page 8, there we have the date, the 11th of September 2020. And again, is that your signature?
It is, yes.
And have you read that second statement recently?
I have.
And are the contents of that statement true?
They are.
And then your third witness statement now, BRE 3035303. There's the third statement. And if we go to page 5, we can see there the date is the 15th of October 2020. And again, is that your signature?
It is, yes.
And have you read that third statement recently?
I have.
And can you confirm that the contents of that are true?
They are, yes.
And have you discussed the contents or the evidence that you're going to give to us with anybody before coming here today?
No.
Okay, let's start with some questions then about your background and your roles and responsibilities. If we pull up your first statement again, BRE 405774 at page 1, at paragraph 2, you tell us in the first lines there that you were a test technician, an engineer with the British Standards Institution between 1979 and 2004. So you spent a long time with the BSI, yes?
That's correct, yes.
And you tell us that your role covered product safety and performance tests for a range of products. And is it right that a particular specialisation of yours during that time was lift safety devices?
That's correct, yes. Towards the end of those years, yes.
Yeah. And you then joined the BRE, the British Research Establishment, in 2004, is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
You see, you tell us that at the beginning of paragraph 4. And you began your role, is this right, in marine equipment directive activities, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
And you subsequently became the certification scheme manager for passive fire protection, is that right?
That's correct.
When did you become that passive fire certification scheme manager?
Probably during late 2005. It was a gradual sort of transition across there due to other members of staff leaving the organisation.
I see. But fairly early on in your career at the BRE, you transferred over to that role, yes?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. And is it right that that role encompassed BS 8414 testing?
It did, yes. Yeah.
And also testing under the Loss Prevention Certification Board scheme?
Yes.
And were those tests under that scheme, I think they were called LPS1 581/2 tests under that Loss Prevention Board scheme, were they similar to BS 8414 tests but with stricter requirements?
They use the same test methodology, it's just the criteria that's different in effect.
Yes. And we heard from Mr. Clark that he said the reason those tests had additional requirements was because they were concerned with insurance loss rather than life safety. Do you agree with him about that?
I do, yes.
Yeah. And then if we could go back to your statement and look at page 2 of that first statement, paragraph 5. You tell us in that paragraph that you spent around 5 years as project manager for BS 8414 testing. Do you see that there?
Yes.
When did you spend those 5 years? What was that 5-year period?
I can't recall exactly when it started, to be quite honest, but it went through until middle of 2013 to late 2013. It was great. It was sort of a gradual development of role as other people moved on or changed their activities or roles within BRE.
I see. So to the best of your recollection, it was 5 years leading up to 2013, is that right? So from around 2008?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. And you also tell us in that paragraph 5 on the same page that you were the Deputy Business Group Manager covering passive fire group test and certification activities. Was that at the same time that you were project manager for 8414 testing?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. And you also tell us in paragraph 7 there, on that second page of your statement, that you were the fire resistance test laboratory manager at the BRE. Now, when was that?
That was from approximately October 2013 through till, whilst my statement says to the present date, I have recently had a change in role since I made this statement. So that went through until November 2020. I'm now the head of passive fire protection group.
Right, yes. So just to be clear, you still work at the BRE, is that right?
I do, exactly, yes.
And you're now the head of passive fire protection?
Yes.
Yeah. And in 2013, is this right, that the 3rd edition of BR 135 was published and you co-authored that with Sarah Colwell of the BRE?
That's correct, yes.
And you were also involved in drafting BS 8414 parts 1 and 2 in 2015, is that correct?
That's correct. It was a redraft. It was sort of the next iteration of that standard, yes.
Yeah. Can you just help us as to when you were doing 8414 testing, the project manager, so from 2008 to 2013, who did you report to at that time?
That would have been between Stephen Howard and Sarah Colwell. They had a joint business manager group role during that period. Relating specifically to BS 8414, it would have been more to Sarah Colwell.
Right. Did you have a single line manager, or were they both line managing you?
They were both line managing.
Yeah. And so it follows that, does it? And this was my next question, that Stephen Howard was senior to you. Is that correct?
Yes, he was, yes.
Yeah. And what about Mr. Clark? Were you senior or junior to Mr. Philip Clark?
I would tend to say that we were on sort of equal footing. It was we were under different sort of management areas. So yeah, it's difficult to answer that question, really.
I see. Was there a clear hierarchy of structure at the BRE, or was it sometimes not always clear who was senior and who was junior?
It was relatively clear.
Okay. Now, I want to ask you some questions now about the purpose of 8414 testing and reporting, yeah. And a few questions about BR 135. Now, thinking back to when you worked on the redraft of BR 135 for its 3rd edition, and that was published in 2013, did you and the other author, Sarah Colwell, consider that BR 135's 2nd edition from 2003 was clear enough that this was a full system test, i.e. 8414 was a full system test? Did you think that had been clear enough in the previous edition?
It's the way that BRE had always interpreted the standard, but I don't think it was necessarily crystal clear in the document itself.
Yes. So was it a deliberate decision in that 3rd edition to try and make that clearer, that it was a full system test that could only apply to that same system?
Sorry, I misunderstood your last question. In terms of system test, yes, part 2, the earlier edition of BR 135 was absolutely clear that it was always a system test. Sorry, I was thinking about something else.
Oh, I see. What was the other thing you were thinking about?
I thought you were talking about the 60-minute duration.
I see.
Sorry.
Let's just look. Sorry. Have you finished?
Yes.
Yeah. Let's just look at something in the third edition of BR 135. If we can pull that up, BRE 405554 at page. Well, let's just pull the document up for a moment. 405554. If we go to the second page, we see there the front page of that publication. So I think that's actually the second edition. We'll come back to that. Mm-hmm. After the publication of BR 135 third edition in 2013, did you think that the industry was clear that any system which had passed an 8414 test had to be replicated exactly in its application on a building, and that any deviation would make the system non-compliant?
Yes, I felt the industry should have understood that.
You say you felt the industry should have understood that, but my question wasn't that. It was, did you think the industry did in fact understand that?
Well, I think during discussions that I had with various members of the industry, there wasn't always full clarity of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And what kind of discussions are you thinking about? Discussions with who in industry?
Well, anybody that I came into contact with during my sort of role as the project manager. I think in general, most people understood that being as a full system test, but there were some people, and I can't remember specifics, but there were some where we had that sort of conversation just to clarify the situation.
Yeah. Now, given that the BRE test and classification reports refer only to the particular test system containing the products installed at the time of the test, do you agree that it was vitally important that the component parts of the test were fully and accurately identified in the test report and any classification report?
Yes. It certainly needs to be accurately described, the components. There are some IP or intellectual property issues relating to some components that clients wish to hold out of the test report and classification, which we sort of understood that approach as well.
When you say you understood that approach as well, does that mean you were sympathetic to the fact that sometimes the test sponsor didn't want to fully record all the details of the tested system?
Yes, I understood that, yeah.
And was there a tension there in practice about the need to faithfully report the details of the system versus the test sponsor's desire to keep certain parts of it confidential?
No, we always took the approach that we would describe it as fully as possible, and in terms of what we knew of the system. There were occasions when the client would then come and ask us if we were able to hold back some detail, usually to do with product names or similar to that, from the report.
Right. And if they came back to you and asked for that, and you felt that that information was important for users of the test report to be aware of, what did you do?
Well, if we felt it was critical in terms of describing the system, then that we would sort of say to the client that we felt that had to go in there. But if it was, if we could describe the the technical aspects of the product without releasing product names, then we felt that was probably okay.
Right, I see. Now we know that the BRE was privatised in March 1997.
Yes.
When you started working on BS 8414, was it your understanding that the BRE was using the 8414 test to BRE's commercial advantage, i.e. to generate income for its other work streams?
Yes, as you may be aware, BRE is actually a charitable trust. We don't actually have any shareholders, so we're not making money for shareholders. What we're doing is supporting the charitable trust in their sort of research and education in the built environment. But to be able to do that, BRE has to generate income to support the charitable trust. So yes, it was any testing that we do is a commercial exercise, but not for shareholder income. It's just to put that money back into the charitable trust and support the ongoing process of BRE in being, as it.
And just to be clear, it's right, isn't it, that the 8414 test was seen as an important source of revenue for the BRE?
Yes, as is any testing that we do. I wouldn't say that was specifically targeted as an important stream any more than any other testing that we do.
Yes. To the best of your recollection, did anyone at any time take steps to consider the inherent conflict of interest in 8414 or indeed other testing being a source of revenue for the BRE?
Sorry, I don't really understand the question.
Yeah, were you aware at any stage of any consideration being given within the BRE to the potential conflict of interest between the needing the revenue from these test procedures to fund other aspects of the BRE's work? Was there ever any serious consideration given to that conflict of interest?
No, I don't recall any of that sort of consideration, and I don't believe that there is a conflict of interest.
Did anyone ever consider the propriety of commercial pressures on a testing house selling tests intended to protect life safety?
No.
Now, I want to ask you about the procedures that the BRE followed in relation to 8414 tests during your time there. Does it follow from the explanation you've given about your roles that you would have been well aware of the procedures between 2008 and 2013? Is that correct?
Yes.
And what about after 2013? Were you still fully aware of what the procedures were around 8414 testing?
I'm fully aware of the procedures, yes.
Yeah.
Just less involved since 2013.
Yeah. Now, just some questions on impartiality. If we go and look at your first witness statement again, BRE 405774 at page 2. If we look at paragraph 9 on the bottom of that page, you say in the first lines of that paragraph, in summary, BRE is an independent and accredited testing laboratory, which may be engaged by test sponsors to carry out specific standardized fire testing. Now, you're accredited by UCAS, yes?
That's correct, yes.
And at all times, were you aware that you were required to meet the standards of BSEN ISO 17025?
Yes.
And there was a 2017 edition of that, but previously also a 2005 edition, yes?
Yes.
Can we just look at that 2005 edition? This is BSI 401726. So this is the edition which would have been in place throughout the periods of time that we're particularly interested in, the 2005 edition. And if we look at page 12 and start with clause 4.1.4 on that page, this is under the broad heading of management requirements. It says there, if the laboratory is part of an organisation performing activities other than testing and or calibration, the responsibilities of key personnel in the organisation that have an involvement or influence on the testing and or calibration activities of the laboratory shall be defined in order to identify potential conflicts of interest. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And was that something you were aware of during the time you were involved in testing activities at the BRE?
I can't say that I was aware specifically of that clause, but of the general premise of that clause, yes.
Did you ever read yourself ISO 17025?
Not in full, no.
And if we look at the bottom of page 12, we can see that clause 4.1.5 begins, and it begins with the laboratory shall, and then we have a number of sub-paragraphs. If we go over the page to 4.1.5D, it says there, the laboratory shall have policies and procedures to avoid involvement in any activities that would diminish confidence in its competence, impartiality, judgment, or operational integrity. So when we talk about BRE's impartiality in this context, was it your understanding that this is what we were referring to?
Yes.
Now, looking at that, the laboratory shall have policies and procedures in place that address all of those matters. To the best of your knowledge, did the BRE have policies and procedures in place which ensured that its testing activities were carried out impartially and with operational integrity?
Yes.
Can you just explain to us what those procedures were? Were they written down or were they communicated orally?
They're written policies through our central quality systems department.
Right. And when you were involved with BS 8414 testing, did you read those policies?
As far as they were relevant to what I was doing, yes.
And did they assist you in terms of explaining how in practice you should maintain impartiality and operational integrity?
Yes.
Can you help us? In what way did you receive guidance on that? Can you remember something specific you were told about how you were to do that?
Well, I can't remember any specific wording, but the general premise of requiring, or the separation of testing and providing clients with specific information on design, or be that design of a product or a system or such like. We can't go into that sort of area if we're involved in the testing.
Was that actually written down in a policy that you were using and aware of, or was that just an understanding that you had?
That's an understanding that I've had for many, many years, even in my time at BSI prior to coming to BRE. It's a general premise that all test and certification organisations work on.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure it must be written down somewhere, but I could not point in the direction of that particular wording.
Yeah. And just to be clear, you can't yourself remember looking up guidance from time to time that helped you in terms of maintaining impartiality and operational integrity? Not
specifically, no. But it's worth remembering that, as mentioned earlier, we are a UCAS accredited organisation, and as such, we are regularly audited by UCAS And this is exactly the type of thing that they would be looking at in detail.
I see. So they would ask questions, would they, about how you'd maintained your integrity and operational independence?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. Mr. Philip Clark told us in his evidence that he had never received any training on impartiality, or where the line was to be drawn between impartiality and, say, the giving of consultancy or advice. For the transcript, that's day 97, pages 88 to 89. Did you ever have such training?
I can't specifically recall it, but I'm sure there has been some training modules in that vein.
I see, but you have no specific recollection of training on that topic?
No, no.
Now, I want to ask you some questions now about recording and checking of systems that are involved in 8414 testing. If we could go at this point to BRE 405773 and look on page 2. So if we look at the second email down on this page, it's sent to you and Tom Lennon and copying in others, including Stephen Howard. And he says there, Tony, Tom, I've looked at the cladding procedure and have updated some of the SOP and drawings. Is that standard operating procedure?
It is.
And he says, please, could you have a look at the attached documents and let me know if you have any comments and or addition? When we are all back in, I will convene a meeting to discuss moving the cladding forward. Now he's talking about 8414 cladding testing, yes? There.
That's correct, yes.
And do you remember this happening where he updated some of the standard operating procedures and drawings?
I don't specifically remember this occurrence, but as with all the testing we do, there is sort of a natural progression and moving forward and trying to improve things, and this was just a typical example of that.
Let's look at some of the documents he was referring to. This is BRE 405773. Actually, it's the next document in this run. Sorry, it's page 3 of this same document. Here we can see a cladding test data file and report preparation sheet, and it's got a checklist. And you can see, for example, in the second item down, it says received client system specifications. In the fifth item down, it says undertaken component check and obtained samples. In the sixth item down, undertaken construction survey and obtained photos, each major layer. And then ninth item down, you can see there's a line, it's just before the halfway point on this page, it says final construction photographs taken. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, so this is effectively a checklist, and it requires a date and a sign off for each of these stages. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Did you have anything like this before this time? So this is in May 2013.
Not that I recall, no.
So were these checks done prior to May 2013?
Yes, I think the checks were done, but it was not in such a regimented process of recording.
And following the introduction of this suite of documents, were these checks, in your experience, diligently carried out?
As far as I'm aware, yes.
When you say as far as I'm aware, why do you say that in terms of caveating your answer?
Only because I don't recall seeing these documents completed in project files after that, the introduction of this. I'm not quite sure when it was finally introduced.
Right. Okay. If we can look at page 7 of this document run, this is another of the documents that Mr. Clark attached. We can see here there's also a system and components photo collection sheet, and that says it's to ensure photographs of the relevant and important components are taken. The following sheet is to be used to collect and log images of the system and its components. Now, again, were photographs regularly taken prior to this point when you were project manager for 8414 testing?
Yes, they were, yeah.
And after this point,
yes.
was it your understanding that photographs were diligently taken to include images of the relevant and important components?
Yes.
And if we can also go to another document, this is BRE 405769 at page 302. This is another document from Mr. Clark's exhibits. We have here it's called Standard Procedures for Undertaking BS 8414 Parts 1 and 2 tests. Do you see that?
Yes.
And again, it has a checklist of actions with different officers in charge. Now, did you have a system like this before 2013?
Not that I recall.
And did you see in test files after 2013 that documents like this were being diligently completed?
No, because after 2013, I wasn't regularly looking at the test files.
But you would have looked at some test files, yes?
I would have looked at some, yes. But,
and those that you looked at, did you ever see checklists like this being completed?
Not that I recall.
Now, drawings now, just some questions about drawings in 8414 tests. Can we look at your first statement at page 4? So it's BRE 405774, page 4. And if we look at paragraph 16, you tell us this. So you've been asked the question, what role, if any, does the BRE play while a test rig is being installed by a test sponsor? And you say in paragraph 16, while a test rig is being installed by a test sponsor, BRE will take notes and photographs of the system being installed by the relevant contractors. Where the test sponsor has provided drawings of the system, these will be compared with the system being installed. Any deviations noted between the drawings and the installation will be discussed with the test sponsor. Now, that's what you told us in your statement. Can you help? Was there a practice of requiring drawings of systems prior to installation when you were in charge of 8414 testing?
There's always been a practice of requesting the drawings from clients. Unfortunately, it's not always been not always been the case that we've always received those drawings in time for the installation to take place.
Right. So if you hadn't received them in time for the installation to take place, did you nevertheless let the installation go ahead?
Yes, yes.
And how would you know then that that installation was consistent with the way the test report would ultimately report that system if you didn't have any drawings?
Well, quite frequently, the sponsor would prepare drawings in relation to the system as built, as opposed to providing drawings prior to the installation. So it would be a case of comparing the build notes to the drawings that may have been received after the installation from the sponsor.
I see. And was that diligently done by the BRE, that you would compare the as-built rig with the as-built drawings that came afterwards?
Yes, as far as we could do that, yes.
When you say as far as we could do that, were there some aspects of that job which would be more difficult? For example, bits of the rig that were covered up?
Well, in respect of cladding, BS 8414 test, there should always be a case of full information being available during the build, in terms of drawing, in terms of photographs and build notes.
Yes, precisely. So those photographs and build notes would become very important, wouldn't they, if you didn't have drawings in advance?
That's correct, yes.
And was it your experience that that process of taking build notes and photographs was a careful and diligent one when you were involved with 8414 testing?
I believe that was the case, yes.
But do you accept that not requiring drawings in advance gives rise to an obvious risk of the system being misdescribed, either accidentally or deliberately, in a later test report?
Yes, there is a potential risk there.
And just pulling your statement back up, the same passage we were just looking at, in the final sentence, you say, any deviations noted between the drawings and the installation will be discussed with the test sponsor. Mm. For what purpose would you be having those discussions about those deviations?
Well, in some cases, the contractor may well have not been an employee of the test sponsor. They may be a subcontractor of the test sponsor. Therefore, we needed to ensure that the contractor was actually building in accordance with the test sponsor's requirements, even though they may be different to what's on the drawing. So we're just raising that as a point to understand the test sponsor's requirements. And also, if we're aware of differences, then we would be asking the test sponsor to provide updated drawings in relation to those differences.
Yes, I mean, you say we're just raising that as a point, but isn't that precisely the problem, that you must need updated drawings, surely, where that occurs?
Yes, that's correct, yes.
And did the BRE always do that, or did they sometimes allow the rig to go up slightly different from the drawings in practice?
Yeah, well, there are occasions where the test sponsor decides to change the design slightly during the installation process. And that's what I meant in terms of trying to understand whether it was the requirement of the test sponsor to make that change, or whether it, in some instances, it may simply be a mistake by the contractor during the build. So we needed to understand whether that was, which side that was, whether it was a mistake by the contractor or a change of design from the test sponsor.
Where that occurred, where there was a change of design during the installation process, were there very clear procedures within the BRE as to what should happen in those circumstances?
Well, as I say, we would ask for drawings to be reissued with those updated details.
And were those always provided?
To my knowledge, yes. Yes.
Right. You don't sound completely sure about that. When you say to my knowledge, what do you mean exactly?
Well, we would always request them. I couldn't say categorically that 100% of the time that we would always receive those.
Yeah. Can you recall any instances where you didn't receive those, but nevertheless the test procedure went ahead?
Well, it would be, the test procedure would invariably go ahead anyway, because we're up against schedules in terms of the test facility. So generally the test would continue if the client was happy with what had been built was reflected to what he wanted to be built. But there would be an ongoing discussion after the event, after the test, with the client as to provision of those updated drawings.
Right, I see. In his oral evidence, Mr. Clark was asked about the purpose of including assembly drawings within 8414 test reports. And for the record, this was at day 97, pages 72 and 73. And he said that he understood the drawings to be a representation of how the system should be put together on a building, rather than being representative of the rig as tested. Now, do you agree with that, or do you disagree with that?
I would disagree with that in parts, in that the BS 8414 test rig, whilst it tries to represent a building as best as it can never, accurately represent a building. It's a test methodology, and therefore the system tested on there needs to be designed around the particular test rig, BS 8414 test rig, and therefore there may be some details that would be slightly different to what would go on a building.
Yes, but it does sound like you would disagree that the drawings would be only representative of how it goes onto a building, rather than being representative of the rig as tested.
Yes, there needs to be a close association between the two for obvious reasons. But in effect, the BS 8414 test is structured around a specific test rig rather than a building.
Yes, I understand that. So, for example, you might get a window in the as-built that's not there in the test. But let's assume we have two bits of the test is the same as a bit of the building that is, pretty much similar to the building as built. The cladding system itself needs to be a very close, in fact, I would say identical representation. Would you agree?
Yes, I would agree from that point of view. But there are some aspects of a BS 8414 test that requires joints in specific positions for the test.
Yes.
And those joints would not necessarily be representative of those positions on a building,
right.
For example.
Just to clarify this, Mr. Baker, I think the question really is the drawing that you expect to receive from the client, which relates to the rig, meant to be a drawing of exactly what is on the rig, rather than a drawing which reflects what would go onto a building?
It should reflect what's on the test rig.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Now, monitoring during the 8414 test process, if we can look at page 4 of your first witness statement and paragraph 17. BRE 405774, yeah. So you tell us there, such monitoring by BRE is also required to ensure that health and safety aspects are being adhered to, and to provide any additional support in terms of waste disposal provision, etc., that the test sponsor or its contractors may require. And then you say this, BRE's monitoring will not run for the entire duration of the installation, but will generally be at key points. Mm-hmm. Now, focusing on that last sentence, where you say that BRE's monitoring will generally be at key points of the installation, in what circumstances would the monitoring not extend to monitoring at key points?
Well, I must admit, I think my wording is probably a little bit woolly in using the word generally. It should always be key points of the build, but to a certain extent we are reliant on the contractor or the test sponsor in advising us when they get to those key points.
I see. So would those key points vary depending on the build?
Yes, absolutely it would, yes.
Yeah. You tell us something else about these key points. If we can, staying with this topic, look at page 5 of your statement and look at paragraph 19. You're being asked who, if anyone, is responsible for any checks or comparison between the actual test rig as installed and the detailed drawings provided by the sponsor.
Mm-hmm.
And you say the test engineer or principal consultant nominated as responsible for a specific test would normally have responsibility for monitoring and checking the detail of the build for reporting purposes. Other BRE staff members may also be asked to assist, as the installation process can often take several days and sometimes even weeks. This checking monitoring does not cover 100% of the build process, but is conducted by means of spot checks at random intervals during the build and at key points when requested by the test sponsor contractor.
Yes.
Now, looking at that last sentence, just breaking it down, so you say it's conducted by means of spot checks at random intervals, is that right?
Yes.
And was that an established procedure that was written down somewhere, that you would do random spot checks during the installation process?
It's probably not written down.
So that was just the convention, was it?
It's just convention, yes.
And then you say, so spot checks at random intervals and at key points when requested by the test sponsor contractor. Now, my question is, did you only check at key points when you were requested to do so by the test sponsor, or did BRE have a clear policy of checking at key points?
Well, what we would normally be doing is talking to the sponsor and contractor during the installation process, and they would give us some guidance in terms of their timelines for their build. And at that point, we would ask them to advise us when they get to those points, so we can take the relevant measurements or photographs as required.
I see. So there wouldn't be any internal guidance to BRE personnel explaining what the key points were likely to be and when those key points ought to be checked?
Well, usually the people involved in the installation or monitoring of the installation would be quite experienced personnel, and they would be aware of what those key points were. Yeah.
So it was just left to those who were in charge of the particular 8414 test to determine what case by case what those key points were.
Yes, depending on the system that was being installed at the time. Yes.
Yeah. Now, just looking at your first witness statement, or staying with that, page 2, paragraph 9. I want to look at the last part of what you say in paragraph 9, 4 lines up from the bottom. You say the test sponsor designs and installs their own test sample. BRE has no role in this due to its requirement to remain independent and impartial. Now, appreciate that the BRE is not involved in the design, you say, of the test sample, but in terms of the installation of the system, can we agree that the BRE would have an important role in monitoring and checking the installation of the system being tested?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Now, in terms of the checking of reports, I just want to ask you some questions about the process for authorising a test report following that report being written. If we look at page 6 of your first statement, so this statement, page 6, at paragraph 26, this is where you're addressing what documents are provided to the person writing or approving a test BS 8414 test report. And you say there, the author of an 8414 report will have access to the full project file, including test sponsor drawing, build notes, photographs during installation, test and post-test, test videos and test data, etc. This information will be a mix of paper and electronic form. And then in the following paragraph, where you're asked the question, what checks are carried out by the BRE before any 8414 test report is approved, you say this, you say, after the author has completed a draft of the test report, that draft will then be sent to another member of the BRE team for an internal checking process. A secured draft, i.e. a draft in PDF format, will usually be sent to the test sponsor so they can check the system description. And then you say any comments received from the test sponsor will then be considered and verified before any amendments are made. And then if we go over the page, you then say in the final sentence of that paragraph, the report then goes through a final checking and approval process by the relevant report authorizer. Now, I want to ask you, did the people carrying out these internal checks and indeed the report authorizer, did they also have access to the full project file?
Yes.
And would you expect the checker and the authorizer to read the documents on that project file as part of that checking and approval process?
During the checking process, yes. The authorizer is not usually quite as an in-depth technical check.
What is the purpose? Can you help us? What is the purpose of the authorization process?
It's sort of more of an oversight to ensure that key clauses are included, correct process has been used, test standards, etc., are correctly used. There will be some review of the system tested and a review of the specification and system tested, but it as I say, it wouldn't be quite as a deep check as the previous checks.
I see. So you would expect the person who checked it before the authorizer, the initial checker, to do a deep check, including checking back against all the contemporaneous test documents, reports, photographs?
Yes, that's what I would normally expect, yes.
And then the authorization process is a shorter process, yes?
Yes, yes.
And a more cursory process, yes?
I don't know that I would use the word cursory, but yes, in essence, that's right, yeah.
8414 and the early termination criteria now. I want to ask you some questions about that. If we can look at your first witness statement on page 2, paragraph 9. We were looking at this paragraph, we were looking 4 lines up from the bottom. I now want to look 2 lines up from the bottom. You say there, BRE then carries out the large-scale fire test to record time and temperature details as expressly set out in BS 8414 parts 1 and 2. written observations of the general performance of the system under test are also taken during the test. These observations will also determine any early termination of the test due to flaming beyond the confines of the test rig or on health and safety grounds. And then you say, if requested by the test sponsor, BRE will produce a test report confirming the nature of the test and recording the relevant time and temperature data. Such a test report will not of itself contain any sort of classification. Now, just thinking about that early termination criteria, can we go to BSI 6097, which is a copy of BS 8414 Part 2. And I want to look at page 11. Here we go. So this is 8414 Part 2. It's 2005. You can see that in the top right-hand corner.
Yes.
And paragraph 8.5 has the test termination criteria. If we can just read that, it says extinguish the heat source 30 minutes after ignition. If no part of the cladding system is still burning, terminate the test. If flaming or monitored temperatures are still rising, continue taking records for an additional 30 minutes up to the maximum test duration of 60 minutes. And then you say that, and then it says the test shall also be terminated, A, if flame spread extends above the test facility, or B, if there is a risk to the safety of personnel or impending damage to equipment. So that's the test termination criteria in 8414 itself. Can we agree that there is no room for discretion in the wording at 8.5a? It says there, the test shall also be terminated if flame spread extends above the test facility. That's a mandatory requirement, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Can you help us? What's your understanding of why that particular wording is included in the test standard? Why should the test be terminated if flame spread extends above the test facility?
Well, if you can sort of consider that the test sample is of a finite height, then if you get flaming above that, you can't then monitor any flame, surface spread of flame or flaming in cavities or anything beyond that point. So you don't know from that point onwards whether any other occurrences would happen. So at that point, you have no, you can gain no further information from the test, and in effect, you have got uncontrolled flame spread on the system.
Yeah. Can you help us as to whether there was ever a practice at the BRE to use its discretion when it came to that paragraph 8.5a, if the flames were only short-lived?
Discretion in terms of actually putting out the crib is...
No, discretion in terms of stating that that test was a termination pursuant to 8414.
No, there's no discretion in that, no.
So I think we heard Mr. Clark explain that sometimes it would be terminated, but you would let the rig burn on, yes?
Yes, yes.
In your experience, did you ever come across any instances where it wasn't terminated officially, even though the flames had reached the top of the rig, because those flames were only transient or temporary?
No, I'm not aware of a situation like that.
And if that happened, what would your approach be to that part of 8414? Would it have failed the test or not?
If we consider that the flaming went above the rig, then as far as we're concerned, that it is termination of the test.
Yeah, okay. Now, I want to ask you some questions now about Kingspan, with particular reference to the K15 phenolic insulation product. And we're going to start back in 2005. We know that Kingspan carried out a test to 8414 Part 1 on the 31st of May 2005 on a system incorporating K15. Now, I think you told us that this was around the time that you became involved in this kind of testing, is that right? Did you have any involvement in that test?
No, I didn't have any involvement in that test. I think that was probably a bit early for my involvement.
Right, I see. Yes, sorry, I think you said 2008 you were certainly project manager for 8414.
Yes, that's correct.
But is it possible that you were involved with 8414 a little bit before that, 2008?
Yes, I was, but not in a formal way.
Can we go to KIN 408847 and look at page 1? This is an internal Kingspan report by Mr. Meredith, Mr. Iva Meredith, and it's dated the 7th of January 2008. We can see that at the bottom of this page. And I just want to ask you about some of the things Mr. Meredith has put in this internal report. If we can go to page 5 and look at the second paragraph, I'm just going to read that to you. So he says this, he says, in 2005, Kingspan tested to the new British standard, formerly known as Fire Note 9, BS 8414 Part 1, and based on the advice of BRE, we used a non-combustible board as cladding. As the BRE stated, if you test with a non-combustible cladding, then you could state, I think that should say your system works with all non-combustible cladding systems. After successfully passing this test, the BRE moved the goalposts and stated that we could only say that our system works with that specific non-combustible board. However, the test result met the criteria of BS 84141 and BR 135 and is a very useful document when securing specifications for facades above 18 meters where the substrata is masonry. The reason for this shift in the BRE's opinion is that they are still learning about this test, and Kingspan were one of the first to test a ventilated rain screen construction. Now, just by way of some context, in his oral evidence to us, Mr. Meredith said that he thought he would have had this conversation with David Hoare or possibly Sarah Colwell, this conversation about if you successfully pass with a non-combustible board, then you can say your system works with all non-combustible cladding systems. And you deal with this in your second witness statement. If we can look at that second statement, BRE 3032261 at page 6. You cover this in paragraphs 19 and 20. We look first at paragraph 19. You're answering here, I think, Mr. Meredith's witness statement at this point. And you say his statement seems to show that Kingspan sought but failed to stretch the BR 135 classification process to cover cladding systems that had not been tested. In his answer to question 9C, he states, I constantly sought to get the BRE to expand what they could say about K15 in accordance with 8414 parts 1 and 2. Also at 9C, he states that the BRE advised if we tested a non-combustible building board, they would give us scope to say that the system tested to could meet the BR 135 requirements when used behind all non-combustible cladding types. And you say he then goes on to describe a meeting which he says that he, Kingspan's Philip Heath, my colleague Sarah Colwell and I were all present. He states that the conclusion of the meeting was that BRE could not commit to being able to give Kingspan scope of application as they simply did not have the knowledge of these systems. And you then say in paragraph 20, I do not recall that meeting, yet I can say that Mr. Meredith's conclusion from a conversation of that type, if it happened, is correct. And you go on to say that BRE as a test house simply couldn't and wouldn't advise a sponsor that a system would be classified to 135 without that specific system being tested. Now, to your knowledge, did you or anyone else at the BRE at any stage suggest or advise Kingspan that the use of non-combustible boards as the putative rain screen material meant that any non-combustible material might also be able to be used, as Mr. Meredith has recollected?
I can't recall anything being said in that vein. I've certainly not been party to that conversation, and I would be very, very surprised if anybody within BRE would make that sort of statement.
Is it possible that someone at the BRE gave that advice when the BRE itself was on a learning curve about the behaviour of these systems? Do you remember a time when the BRE was itself learning about system behaviour in 8414 tests?
I think it's fair to say that we're always learning, whatever tests that we're doing, and BS 8414 in those dates were a relatively new test for us. So yes, we were learning in terms of system performance, which, from that respect, I would be even more surprised if we were to be making those sorts of statements. If we don't have the knowledge to do so, then we certainly couldn't be making those sorts of statements. And at the end of the day, it would be outside our remit to be doing so anyway.
So you don't ever recall a time when the BRE internally may have thought that if you tested one non-combustible cladding board, you would then be able potentially to say that any non-combustible cladding board would satisfy the BR 135 criteria and could be used in these systems? No, I don't recall anything like that. No recollection of that? No. Well, can you help us as to what Mr. Meredith might have been referring to then?
I'm afraid I can't help you with that.
Right. So you can't help us as to how he came by that understanding when Kingspan were beginning to carry out these 8414 tests with the BRE?
The only thing that I could say, and it's purely conjecture on my part, is that my understanding, although I wasn't involved with that test or for some time, is that my understanding of that test was the system was a fairly indicative system. So I would assume from BRE's point of view that it wasn't a representative system. They were trying to understand the performance of K15 behind various different types of board or system, and therefore, there may have been, as I say, this is conjecture on my part, there may have been sort of a general discussion about that, if that may be a way to check or the performance if you put some sort of board in front. But that in no way is saying if you do that, then it is all, that will cover you for any type of non-combustible board.
When you say it was a fairly indicative system, can you help us with what you mean by that?
Yeah, well, that as a system is, in my view, is not a system that would be used on a building.
Yeah, and can you help us as to why that's your view?
Because I don't believe the type of board that was used could be used as an external weatherproof board.
Yes. So it didn't have any kind of exterior rain screen surface or coating on it. So you thought at the time, did you, that it was an indicative test? Is that right?
Well, not an indicative test per se, because the test was run in fully in accordance with BS 8414. The system itself, I understood as being an indicative system.
Yes, I understand.
That's subtle differences, I realise. But
no, absolutely, and we are going to come back to this topic actually when we discuss the BR 135 classification of that system. But this is helpful. Mr. Chairman, I'm midway through this topic, but I think this is as good a moment as any for the break.
Yeah, very well. Well, I said we'd have a break during the morning, Mr. Baker. We'll take it now. We'll come back, please, at 11:30 to continue your evidence. And in the meantime, while we're having the break, please don't speak to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it. All right?
okay, thank you.
Very good. See you later. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to continue hearing from Mr. Baker. Mr. Baker, I hope you can see me and hear me well. Can you?
Yes, I can.
Good. Thank you very much. In that case, you're ready to carry on, I hope. I'll ask Ms. Grange to continue putting some questions to you. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Mr. Baker. We had been discussing the 2005 Kingspan K15 test. And are you aware that the outer facade in that test report from May 2005 is recorded as a cement particle board?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
And when did you become aware of that, do you think?
I can't remember the first time that I looked at that report, to be quite honest.
Okay, yeah. Are you aware that Kingspan now say that the test report is not accurate and that the material used as that outer face was a cellulose fibre cement board?
I've recently become aware of that, yeah.
Yeah. Can you help us as to how that confusion might have come about? The report records one thing, but Kingspan are now saying that something slightly different was tested.
I can't really say. We would have reported as advised originally by Kingspan. Why the change, I don't know.
Yeah. And Mr. Meredith has said in his oral evidence for the transcript, that's day 76, page 207, that such a board was not traditionally suitable for the outermost layer of a cladding system. And it sounds like you agree with that. Is that right? I
agree with that, yes.
Yeah. And if we can look on this point at your third witness statement, BRE 3035303 at page 3, and in particular paragraph 12, this is under the heading correspondence dated 9th of September 2015 between myself and Ms. Galbsite. Now, we'll come back to that topic in relation to the 135 classification report, but just for now, looking at what you say this communication relates to a fully compliant BS 8414 test conducted for Kingspan insulation under the BRE report number 220876, originally conducted in 2005. This test was conducted on a system of which, from my perspective, was not a complete system. Now, when you say not a complete system, is that because of the answer you just gave a moment ago, because the board was not a board that you consider would have actually been used on high-rise buildings?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, I want to show you at this point, so I'm going to take you through the K15 story broadly chronologically. I want to turn to something from 2006. If we can go to KIN 405350. This is a flyer produced by Kingspan. It's a flyer called What's Lurking Behind Your Facade, and it was produced in 2006 after the May 2005 test to 8414 part 1. Were you aware of this kind of promotional literature by Kingspan at the time in relation to K15?
I can't say that I was specifically aware about this document.
Were you aware of other Kingspan K15 marketing literature?
No, I was more aware of the certification issued by BBA and such like.
Yeah, and the LABC.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, we will come on to that. Now, Kingspan at this time did not have a BR 135 classification report for the May 2005 test, did they?
No.
And if we look at the first paragraph that starts in the red text in the second half of that page, you can see it says Kingspan Cooltherm K15 rain screen board has not only been tested by the BRE and awarded certification to BS 8414 part 1, but it has also been assessed and approved in accordance with BR 135. Now that's a wholly inaccurate assertion there, isn't it?
It is, yes.
And it's also inaccurate in that a product can't be awarded that certification, can it?
Exactly, yes. It's a system test, not an insulation board test.
Exactly. And I just want to turn to an internal Kingspan email about this. This is KIN 405179. This is an email dated the 8th of June 2006, sent by Mr. Meredith to others within Kingspan. And if we just look, this is, you wouldn't have seen this at the time, but what he says in the first two paragraphs is this. He says, please note, the K15 What's Lurking Behind Your Facade flyer has been withdrawn by the marketing department, partly because it's considered not a good sales tactic to highlight the fact that you don't need class 0 below 18 meters. Also, the BRE have complained about the use of the word approved and certification in our text. These are privileges that would cost us an additional 20K. Now, just pausing there, it would appear that someone within the BRE has seen this What's Lurking Behind Your Facade flyer, yes?
Yes, yeah.
Does that help you? Can you recall anything more about that at this time?
No, it's probably not something I would have been involved in at that time.
Do you think it's correct that the BRE would have charged an additional £20,000 to issue a classification report for this test?
No, I think what Iva is actually referring to there is related to the approval or certification. I think he's probably had discussions at some stage regarding LPCB approval of the system.
I see.
And that's likely to, well, I don't think even that would cost £20,000, but that might well include a test as well. But that's my assumption of what he's talking about there. It certainly wouldn't be a cost of that for a BR135.
Are you able to help us as to who it was at the BRE that had complained about the use of the word approved and certification in the text?
No, not specifically. I would assume it would be either sort of Sarah Colwell or maybe Dr. Debbie Smith.
When Mr. Meredith gave oral evidence for the transcript, this is at day 75, page 124, he wasn't very clear, but when asked about this and who it was that had complained, he said, I don't know if it was Tony Baker. And then he was asked, do you think it could have been him? And he said, I think it could have been him, yeah. So is he wrong about that it wasn't you that complained about this flyer?
No, I didn't have any discussions regarding that.
Were you ever aware of the BRE complaining about the language used in Kingspan's marketing material for K15?
Not specifically about marketing material that I'm aware of.
So are you saying not specifically about marketing material because you are recalling conversations or concerns about certifications it had?
Yes, that's it, yes.
I see. And who do you recall at the BRE having concerns about that?
What about the certification or?
Yeah.
Again, I think it was probably through Sarah Colwell, potentially Dr. Debbie Smith. I think they became aware of particularly the BBA certification and probably the LABC certification as well.
And do you remember discussions taking place within BRE about those certifications at the time?
I do remember regarding the BBA certification. I don't recall the issues with the LABC.
I see. Now, do you remember a test to BS 8414 Part 2 on a steel-framed structure, which was carried out in December 2007? That test was sponsored by Kingspan, SOTEC and METSEC. Do you remember that?
Vaguely.
Now, if we can go back to that internal report we were looking at before from Mr. Meredith, KIN 408847. This is the internal report prepared by Mr. Meredith of the 7th of January 2008. We looked at that earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can look at page 2 now, we were on page 5 that we were looking at. And under the heading test witnesses, in the middle of that page, can you see there's a list of names: John Eggington, James Gellier, and then you're there, Tony Baker, and it says LPCB. Do you see that?
Yes, yeah.
Does that help? Do you think you did attend that test in December 2007?
Yes, I think perhaps there was some discussion with, well, I don't know whether it was specifically Kingspan or it may have been Sotec or whoever, regarding potential certification to the LPS 1581 or 1582 standards in relation to that test.
Right, so that was your role, sorry.
So I would have simply been there as an observer from the certification perspective.
Yeah. And is it right that Sarah Colwell and Phil Clark were also there for the BRE?
Well, to be honest, I don't specifically remember the test. So, but yeah, that wouldn't be unusual.
Can you remember that in late 2007, there was significant interest amongst BRE employees in attending tests to 8414 Part 2 tests? Can you remember there being interest in that?
There's general interest in those types of tests anyway, because they're large-scale tests, and it's useful for other people within BRE to understand the types of tests that we conduct.
Yeah.
And as this is a large-scale test, then yes, that wouldn't be unusual for others to be there just as witnesses to, just from their training perspectives.
Yeah. And do you have any recollections of the performance of the system when it was tested then in December 2007?
I don't specifically. Obviously, I've seen this document, so I understand that it didn't complete the test.
Yes, I mean it was a little bit worse than that. If we look at the bottom of this page, results. Can you see it says by 17 minutes the top fire barrier had breached and the raging inferno moved up to the top thermocouples and pushed them past 600 degrees, thus failing the simple criteria of BR135.
Yes.
And then it says 8414 Part 2 does not have a pass or fail. It needs to be cross-referred within BR135. And then going over the page, he continues. He says this: the phenolic was burning on its own steam and the BRE had to extinguish the test early because it was endangering setting fire to the laboratory. Now, does that help with your recollection? Can you recall a test that was that unsuccessful at that time?
I think it's probably quite flowery wording from Iva in this report, to be honest. But yeah, when I read those comments, it did ring bells. Yes.
Can you recall the test being a spectacular failure?
I can remember a failure. Yes.
Okay.
But obviously, in the role that I do, I've seen many tests. A number of them have been failures. A number of them have been passes. It's difficult to actually determine it in my mind which test was which.
I see.
Looking back in time.
Now, staying with this page, if we can go down to the bottom of this page, there's a section that begins comments from the BRE. Can you see that there?
Yes. Yeah.
Comments from the BRE, and we have the following text. It says, the official line, it's a system failure. No individual component can be solely held responsible for the failure. However, and then in brackets, it says unofficial comments. It was apparent that the insulation was fully involved in the test. Surface spread of flame was apparent and the core continued to burn when the flame source had been extinguished. they stated they did not remember the product performing like that last time. Now, are you able to help us as to who made those official and unofficial comments?
No, I don't recall being party to that discussion.
Were you solely there as a representative of the Loss Prevention Board, or were you also there because by this time you were involved in 8414 testing? And
I was certainly getting more involved with 8414 testing by that stage, yes. But I think from the perspective of this test, I think there was a view to looking at the certification process.
Can you recall who at the BRE was taking main responsibility for this test?
I believe it would have been Phil Clark.
Right. And any comments during the test, would those most likely have come from Mr. Clark?
Mr. Clark or Sarah Colwell.
Were you, sorry.
Sorry, I don't agree with the comments of official line and unofficial comments. That doesn't sort of mean anything to me.
Can you explain why that doesn't mean anything to you?
Well, we don't have a process of issuing official comments and unofficial comments. It's just not what we do. We may discuss the performance of a test with the sponsor, but they wouldn't be in terms of official line and unofficial line.
I appreciate that when those comments are made, they might not be headlined and signposted with, here's our official comments, here's our unofficial comments. That might have been Mr. Meredith putting it in those categories. But in your experience, particularly thinking back to this time, was it common for there to be discussions after the test, including comments on how different components of the test had behaved in it?
I wouldn't say it's common, but if there's a clear driver for any particular failure, then that might be discussed in general. Yes.
Now, were you aware at the time of this test, so December 2007, that the K15 product that was being tested was a different product from the one that had been tested in 2005?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Again, in Mr. Meredith's oral evidence, this is for the transcript, day 75, page 161, he said that this change, this transfer to a new formulation of K15 that had happened in 2006 was something that he thought he might have discussed with you. Now, do you have any recollections of that?
I have absolutely no recollection of that discussion or any such discussion, no.
Were you in discussions with Iva Meredith from time to time around this time, so 2006, 2007, 2008?
Yes, but probably for a number of different reasons, not just BS 8414. Kingspan were looking at a number of different projects at different times.
And did you have any discussions with Mr. Meredith either during or after this test?
Not that I recall.
Now, just staying with that same document, that report by Mr. Meredith at KIN 408847, if we look at page 6 now. Yes, and under heading 3 there, it says the tested system. It says this, following much discussion, we agreed on a system that we and the BRE believed had the best chance of passing. Below details the construction from inside to the exposed face. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Now, can you recall whether there were discussions between the BRE and Kingspan about the system that had the best chance of passing?
No, it's not the sort of conversation that we would have with any clients.
Were you aware of anyone else at the BRE working in collaboration with Kingspan at this time on these kind of issues?
No, I wasn't aware of anybody.
Now, in 2009, were you aware that in May 2009, Kingspan obtained a system approval certificate from the LABC for K15?
I've subsequently become aware, yes.
When you say subsequently, when did you become aware?
Well, only recently. I wasn't aware, to my recollection, I wasn't aware at that time.
Well, let's have a look at BRE 3012252. And I want to look at, this is an email string. BRE 3012252. And I want to look at the first email in the chain at the bottom of that page, if we could expand that. This is from John Raybould. Now, he was a BRE employee, yes?
Yes, yeah.
And it's sent on the 14th of May 2009 to you, to Sarah Colwell, to Stephen Howard, and copying in Norman MacDonald and Debbie Smith. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And what was Mr. Raybould's role within the BRE?
John is business development manager.
And we can see it reads, "Hi folks, I've managed to get an LABC certificate from Hertfordshire that says the Kingspan K15 insulation can be used in a mixture of insulation thicknesses, masonry or steel frame substrates, a min cavity gap of 50 millimeters with a range of rain screen claddings. I'm sure that this will be sent to us officially by Kingspan when Mark Stevens gets back from the Middle East. I would like to think we have tried to establish some guidelines like I was proposing so that we could at least give Mark some help with his system configurations. Also note that this appears to give automatic acceptance for systems over 18 meters. And then he says, let me know how we want to move forward." So that's the email.
Yeah.
Now, does that help you? You said you don't think you were aware of the LABC system approval certificate. But does this help you as to whether, in fact, you were aware back in May 2009?
Well, clearly I was involved. I was copied in or sent that from John. So yes, I must have been aware at the time, but I don't recall it as I sit here at the moment.
Yeah. And in the second paragraph, there's reference to the fact that Mr. Raybould thinks it will be sent officially to us by Kingspan when Mark Stevens gets back from the Middle East. Can you just help us? Who was Mark Stevens?
Mark Stevens works for Kingspan.
Yeah, he worked for Kingspan off-site, is that right?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. And do you have no recollection following this email of going and reading this LABC certificate to which your attention is being drawn?
I must admit, I don't have a recollection of doing so. I must have done, but I don't recall doing so.
Was it Kingspan's usual practice to send their product certificates, whether that was LABC or otherwise, to the BRE? You can see that Mr. Raybould is saying that he thinks it will be sent to us officially by Kingspan. Was it Kingspan's usual practice to send that kind of documentation to the BRE?
No, I wouldn't say so, not specifically.
In that second paragraph, in the second sentence, he's there saying, I would like to think we have tried to establish some guidelines like I was proposing, so we could at least give Mark some help with his system configurations. Can you help us as to what these guidelines were that had been established to try and give Kingspan some help with system configurations?
Yeah, well, I was aware at the time that John Raybould was having discussions with Mark Stevens regarding a number of systems that they were looking to get tested. and there was some discussions around what systems require testing to cover a scope of applications, and it ended up quite a large potential test program. I don't think it ever progressed.
Right. Is that reference to guidelines also a reference to the BRE trying to put in place some boundaries for Kingspan as to what could properly be claimed about the use of K15 over 18 metres?
I'm not so sure that's what John's referring to. I think he's more referring to the a test matrix or a test plan that he was discussing with Mark Stevens at that time.
But he appears to be saying this in the context of drawing attention to a very broad LABC certificate. Can you recall there having been any discussions with Kingspan about the need to ensure that its certifications were properly accurate based on the test evidence?
Well, I believe further up this email chain, there was potentially further discussion between Sarah Colwell and Debbie Smith, and possibly Stephen Howard, but I wasn't involved in that. What progressed after that, I don't know.
I see. Are you referring to the email immediately above this?
Yeah.
So Sarah Colwell says to Debbie Smith and Stephen Howard, Debbie, Steve, we need to discuss this urgently. You were aware of those discussions at the time, were you?
Well, as you see, I wasn't actually copied into that that email from Sarah, so I don't know whether I would have been aware or not. I guess I would have been from the sidelines point of view, but I wasn't involved in any specific discussions.
And from the sidelines, can you help us as to what exactly they were discussing at that time?
Well, I guess it was based on the broad brush statement on the LABC certificate.
Do you remember there being a concern within the BRE about how broad brush that LABC certificate was?
Yeah, I've later become aware of it. Yes, as I say, I don't recall it at this specific time, but over time I've become aware of it. Yes.
When you say I've become aware of it over time, is that because while you were involved in 8414 testing at the BRE, you came to become aware that there had been concerns about certification around this time?
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Yeah. But you can't help us as to precisely when you became aware of this?
No, I can't tell you on that.
Let's look at an email chain now from 2010. This is BRE 403327. And if we can look at the first email in the chain, which is at the bottom of page 1. Right at the bottom of page 1, we can see an email from Mr. Meredith to Phil Clark on the 25th of March 2010 with the subject BS84 testing. And then if we go over the page to see the content of that email, he says, Phil Clark, I hope all is well. I have 2 new insulation products that I would like to test in the BS8414. Potentially, I would like 2 official tests. However, it may also be 2 indicatives. This depends on costs. And he goes on and he says both tests would need to be on a masonry substrate. And he asks about the dimensions of the rig and other questions about the specifics of that. So he's got 2 new insulation products he wants to test and potentially wants 2 official tests. However, it may also be 2 indicatives. And then if we move up the chain back on page 1, we can see that Mr. Clark responds on the 30th of March 2010 And he says, Iva, I'm well, thanks, happy to hear from you. In terms of the questions below, a couple of BS84 tests, not a problem, and we will be able to also do some indicative tests as required. Suggest that you speak with my colleague Simon, CC'd into this email. That's Simon Ashton Jones, it would appear, to speak about costs, etc. And then if we go to the next email above that, this is sent by you on the 30th of March at 16:53. Sorry, there's an email, yes, on the 30th of March at 16:14, and you say, if we do indicatives, so it's from you to Phil Clark and Stephen Howard, so this is an internal email now.
Yeah.
If we do indicatives, how would this be reported? Just reading between the lines of Iva's email, it seems as though he would try to pass off indicatives as being full tests, or am I just being a cynic, exclamation mark. And then Phil Clark responds, he says at the top, I would suggest that the supply of the data in a brief letter would suffice, but no more than that. Now, just breaking down what you say there, you start by saying, if we do indicatives, how would this be reported? What do you mean there when you say, or what did you mean at the time when you said, if we do indicatives? What did you mean by that?
Well, I wasn't sure of what level of indicative test Iva was looking for, whether it's similar in vein to the test that was done in 2005, or whether it's a test with different thermocouples or no thermocouples, or what. At that stage, I didn't know what he was actually looking for or referring to.
And you say, you're talking about different levels of indicatives. And I think later you draw a distinction between an indicative, which was, say, a research and development type indicative, or an indicative which wasn't a system you'd use in the real world, but was one that could actually go through the full 8414 test. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. If an indicative test was done, is there a special way in which the results were reported? So let's take a test whereby it's not a complete cladding system. How would those results be reported?
Well, in that case, we would typically do what we would class as a short form letter report. So it would just be a brief outline of what was done, what the system consisted of, and the results in terms of data. Or it might just be a simple 1 or 2 page what we deem as a letter report, rather than a formal test report, and provide the test data to the client. I
see. So if you done a test not on a complete cladding system, you might just issue a letter with the results in it.
That's correct, yes. Or sometimes we might only issue the test data itself. So sometimes that's all clients actually require.
But if it was a complete system, but the manufacturer told you that they were using it as an indicative test, would that affect the way in which the 8414 report was written? If
it had been commissioned as a full test report or a full test, then typically we would issue a full test report.
And would it record anywhere in that report that that was considered to be an indicative test because of some factor relevant to that, such as the fact that the cladding board was not representative?
I think, where we are now, yes, that would be the case.
But back then, you say where we are now.
I think that's why I was asking the question, because I was aware of the 2005 test at that stage, and I was aware that there was confusion over that test.
So are you saying that the BRE's procedures would be different now if that 2005 test were run again?
Yes, I believe it would be, yes.
And in what way would your procedures be different?
We would be clearer in the type of report that we issued.
And it would make it clear, would it, that it was, in some senses, an indicative test?
Yes.
Now, going back to your email that we were just looking at, we looked at just the very first part of your short email. If we can have that back up. So you start by saying, if we do indicatives, how would this be reported? So is it right, you're raising the very question we've just been discussing?
Exactly that, yes, yeah.
And then you go on and you say, just reading between the lines of Iva's email, it seems as though he would try to pass off indicatives as being full tests, or am I just being a cynic? Now, just can you help us? What was the basis for that concern at the time?
Well, as I say, I think I had in my mind the test of 2005, and my belief that was an indicative system as opposed to a full marketable system.
So does it follow that by this time you were aware that Kingspan had been trying to pass that off as being, you say, a full test there?
Mm.
Is that what you meant at the time?
Yes, I believe that's what I was referring to. Yeah. And
how do you come to know that Kingspan were trying to pass off indicatives as being full tests?
Well, I'm struggling to sort of remember actual timelines, but yeah, we were aware that the 2005 test was being used to basically state for Kingspan, basically stating that their K15 test had insulation had passed the test and had been effectively given a classification. And I just, the wording used there is not my normal style, to be quite honest. So I was just a bit, maybe I was just a bit unsure of where this one was going.
Yes, understood. Did Mr. Howard have the same awareness of you as you at the time, that Kingspan had been trying to pass off indicatives as being full tests?
I believed he did, but I don't know that we ever discussed this email chain any further. I think Phil's response was probably the correct response, and that's the way that we went with it, if that was to be progressed.
And were individuals like Debbie Smith and Sarah Colwell also aware that Kingspan had been trying to pass off indicatives as full tests?
Indicative in terms of the system, as opposed to a full test, not a full test. Yes, they were aware of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know whether the BRE ever took any steps to alert anyone else outside its organisation to those concerns?
We had discussions with BBA.
And anyone else?
I don't recall. Whether discussions were held with LABC or not, I don't know.
Okay. And if we look at Mr. Clark's response to you and Mr. Howard, again, at the top of that page, can we agree, based on his response, that he was aware at the time? Hence, he's suggesting that the supply of data and a brief letter would suffice, but no more than that.
I don't know whether he was actually aware of the full scope of the issue, but that would lead me to believe that he was. Yes.
Yeah. Why wouldn't he have been aware if you and Mr. Howard and Debbie Smith and Sarah Colwell were all aware? why wouldn't Mr. Clark have been aware too?
Well, as I say, I don't know whether he was or not, but Phil, the way that we were organised at that time, I believe, Phil Clark was actually under a different line management.
Who was he line managed by at that time?
Stephen Manchester.
Right, I see.
In the way that we operated, within the passive department, we project managed in terms of the front end inquiry and that sort of thing for BS 8414. But effectively, we internally subcontracted the test to the people that actually ran the burn hall, which was Steve Manchester and Phil Clark.
Right. How proximate were you to them in terms of your offices? To Steve Manchester and Phil Clark? Were you close by, or were you in a separate part of the BRE?
I think relatively close by, but to be honest, we've moved offices so many times, I can't recall at any particular stage.
Fair enough. Then let's look at another email chain now. This is moving forward in time to 2013. If we can go to BRE 403397. This is an email chain between you and Andy Russell. Now it's right, isn't it, that Andy Russell is also an employee of the BRE, yes?
That's correct, yes. He's our assessment engineer.
And was he a senior consultant in the BRE's passive fire protection department around this time, 2013?
Yeah, yes, I believe that was his title. He mainly deals with desktop assessments.
Right, I see, yeah. And then if we look at his email just to you at the bottom of that page on the 24th of July 2013, he says, hi Tony, I've had a request to write an assessment for a cladding system in Leeds. Sorry, I should have noted the subject is Kingspan K15 and BS 8414. So he's had a request to write an assessment for a cladding system in Leeds. Basically, it's a BS 8414 system, i.e. it's fixed back to steelwork. However, the only test data that I have for K15 was for a BS 8414 Part 1 test, where the cladding was fixed back to masonry. My gut feeling is that they should test this new system, even though I think that the test data that I have is probably sufficient to say that the proposed system would pass a test to BS 8414 Part 2. Having said all that, I've just come across a report that Norman wrote where there was no BS 8414 test data at all. Anyway, I'd appreciate your opinion, as I haven't had much involvement with these cladding systems. Now, the Norman that he refers to there, was that Norman MacDonald, who also worked at the BRE?
Yeah, that's correct, yes.
And can you help us, what was Norman MacDonald's role at the BRE?
Norman worked with Andy on assessments. Well, I think at that time, Norman was probably, or before this time, Norman was previously Andy's line manager.
Yeah. And then if we go up the page, we can see you respond that day from Tony Baker to Andy Russell, and you copy in Stephen Howard. Sorry, you actually make Stephen Howard a main recipient of this reply. And you say this: hi Andy, strangely enough, me and Steve have just come out of a meeting with Wintec, and this project was mentioned, or one very similar. I would need more info on the through system build-up before commenting, but in general, the answer would be no, unless the system to be assessed was very similar to that tested. I believe the test data available from Kingspan would be very limited, and the market is starting to get very confused through clever marketing by Kingspan. I know Norman did an assessment some time ago, but from what I can recall, it was an enclosed system. But from what we understand today, it wasn't built in accordance with the assessment, ! And they say, cheers, Tony. Now, just looking at that first line of your email, you say that you and Steve, presumably that's Steve Howard, have just come out of a meeting with Wintec, yes?
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
What was that meeting about? Can you help us?
I don't recall specifically, but Wintec are sort of a design company, sort of contract company for external cladding systems. I think it was a meeting that was set up by Steve Howard.
Yes. Do you think that meeting was about the use of K15 on high-rise buildings?
Not specifically. I think it was more general than that.
But could that topic have been discussed at that meeting?
It would appear that that was part of that discussion for whatever reason.
Yeah. And can you remember, you may not be able to, but can you remember who at Wintec you met at this time?
No, I'm afraid I can't, no.
And looking at the fourth line of your email, third line down, you say, I believe the test data available from Kingspan would be very limited. And the market is starting to get very confused through clever marketing by Kingspan. Now, it's right, isn't it, that by July 2013, Kingspan still only had one test report to 8414 for a system incorporating K15, which had been successful, yes?
I believe so, yes. Yeah.
And to part one only, yes?
Yes.
And that was the May test, yes?
Yes, I believe so.
And is that what you meant when you say, I believe the test data available from Kingspan would be very limited?
Yes, and that seems to agree with what Andy was saying in his initial email.
And can you help us when you say, and the market is starting to get very confused through clever marketing by Kingspan, what were you referring to there in terms of Kingspan's marketing?
Well, it comes back to this issue where I think Kingspan were trying to push their insulation rather than systems, and sort of generally inferring to the market that their insulation was approved to BS 8414 and 135.
Yeah.
And I do think that was causing some confusion in the market in general.
Yeah, and again, in general, can you help us as to how you would have become aware of that? How did you become aware of that at the time?
Well, I think it was probably through the discussions that we were having with the companies such as Wintec, and our awareness of the BBA and LABC type certificates and such and things like that.
Yeah. Can we just look at Kingspan's product literature that was in date at this time? So this is KIN 403545. This is the 9th issue of their Cool Firm K15 rain screen board product literature. We can see in that very top right-hand corner, if we could expand the screen, we can see the 9th issue says March 2011, but I can tell you, you can take it from me, that this issue was not updated until July 2016. So it was current at the time you were meeting with Wintec in 2013.
Okay.
Now, do you think you had seen this literature or previous versions of it at around that time, so by 2013?
I think I probably had, yes.
Yes. And if we pan back to the whole page, you can see in the text that's highlighted, there's a number of bullets that give key points about K15. And you can see it there in the third bullet, it's highlighted helpfully for us. It says successfully tested to BS 8414, 2002. Note, it doesn't tell you which part. Can meet the criteria within BR 135 and is therefore acceptable for use above 18 meters. Now, do you agree that that assertion is wholly inaccurate?
Yes, I believe that can be misrepresented, basically. Yeah.
Yes, a product can't be successfully tested to BS 841.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
Can it?
No,
it's a very clear, bold statement, isn't it? At the end there, it is therefore acceptable for use above 18 meters. Yes.
Yes.
So you would have been in no doubt when you read that, would you, that that was misleading? Yes.
I believe that to be misleading.
Yes, and you believed that when you read it. Yes.
I probably did, yes. As I say, I probably have seen this in the past. I would fully expect that I have, and I don't think I would have changed my view.
Yes, thank you. And if we go on to page 6, under the heading Fire Performance, you see on the right-hand side, there's a heading Fire Performance. And it says, sorry, I think it's actually lower than we've got there. If we can go, so I can come back out. Yes, at the bottom of that page, at the bottom right, so it's under the big heading Fire Performance, but there's two smaller headings, Construction and then Result, on the right-hand side. If we look at that paragraph, it reads, the tested product meets the criteria stated within BRE 135, Fire Performance of External Thermal Insulation for walls of multi-storey buildings, and is therefore acceptable for use above 18 metres in accordance with the building regulation standards. Now that's wholly misleading as well, isn't it?
It is misleading, but they've put that against a section which gives the construction of the system that was tested. So there would be an argument around that. I
see. But again, it's starting off saying the tested product meets the criteria. So it's
from that respect, yeah.
Yeah, we can agree that's misleading, yes?
Yes.
And just going back to that email that that we were looking at earlier. So BRE 403397, yes, thank you. And in the fourth line, where you've said, I believe the test data available will be very limited and the market is starting to get very confused through clever marketing by Kingspan. Who in the market did you consider was starting to get very confused?
I think designers, let's say Wintech. It's difficult to say a specific sector of people, really. It's more a general understanding or a general feeling.
Did you say that because you knew of examples where K15 had been used on high-rise buildings?
No, I don't know of specific examples that I could state.
Right, but you were aware, were you, that professionals in the construction industry were beginning to get very confused?
Yes, as a general statement, that's correct, yes.
Yeah, and it was confused about whether or not you could use K15 over 18 metres, yes?
Yes.
And can you recall, did other colleagues at the BRE share that view? So we can see that you've sent this email to Stephen Howard. Did he share your view that the market was starting to get very confused through clever marketing by Kingspan?
Well, I think the only reason I've included Steve in that email is because we'd literally just come out of the meeting together, and I was probably typing this on my phone, sitting on the train next to him or in a car next to him.
Yeah.
But I would be surprised if Stephen wasn't aware. I know Sarah Colwell and Dr. Debbie Smith are aware.
So they were also aware, yes, that the market was starting to get very confused through clever marketing by Kingspan.
Sarah Colwell, definitely, yes.
And Debbie Smith.
Debbie Smith, I would assume so from discussions that we'd had here.
Yes. And what about Phil Clark by this time? You've been involved in 8414 now for some years, yes?
Yes.
Mr. Clark was also involved, yes?
Yes.
Was he also aware that the market was starting to get very confused through clever marketing?
I would assume that by this time he would have been, yes. Because we would have had discussions, just general discussions at such times, yeah.
Yes. So can we take it that there were discussions within the BRE about concerns over Kingspan's clever marketing?
Yes, I wouldn't say that we schedule specific meetings to discuss it. It's just something that comes up in conversation when you're talking about particular companies.
Yeah. And can you recall, this is now 2013, whether any steps had been taken by the BRE to contact anybody outside of the BRE to discuss these concerns?
No, as I said earlier, we did have some discussions with BBA regarding their certificates. I say we, it wasn't me specifically. I think that was Sarah Colwell.
Yes. We're going to come to that in just a moment.
Other than that, no, not that I am aware of. But we're in a sort of a difficult position in that BRE is not a regulatory body, and therefore we don't really have any power to have those discussions. Let's put it that way. Or we don't feel that we do.
I appreciate what you're saying about your powers, but would you accept that if you had concerns about products being cleverly marketed for use for which they were not appropriate and not appropriate on life safety grounds, the BRE could have taken it upon itself to contact others, couldn't they?
Potentially, yes, but I'm not sure that we're aware of specific instances where the clever marketing is one thing, but it's having specific instances where we have specific concerns about a building or something that's being installed on a building is something different. And I think under those circumstances, this is the second instance, yes, we would probably make it a point of contacting somebody. But as I sit here at the moment, I'm not sure who that somebody would be.
Yeah. Just going back to Andy Russell's email to you, so it's on BRE 403397. In the third line, he says, my gut feeling is that they should test this new system, even though I think that the test data I have is probably sufficient. Now, just to be clear, the subject of desktop assessments is one which the inquiry is going to come back to in much greater detail at a later stage in module 6 of the inquiry's work. But for now, since we're here and looking at this, I want to just ask you a few more questions about this. Can you help us as to what this assessment is that Andy Russell is referring to, carried out by Norman MacDonald, with no BS 8414 test data at all? Can you help us about that?
No, I can't, to be quite honest, although, from my response in my responding email, it says that I know that Norman did an assessment some time ago. I don't actually recall what that was about or what that assessment was now.
Yeah.
Not something I've looked back on at all.
Yeah. In your response, you say it was an enclosed system. Can you help us as to what you meant there by an enclosed system?
Yeah, I guess it means it's not a ventilated system.
Right, I see.
So it's enclosed panels, I think.
And you've said, how did you come to learn that the project was not even built in accordance with the assessment? That's what you said at the very end.
Yeah.
I understand it wasn't built in accordance with the assessment. You put an exclamation mark there. Can you recall how you became aware of that?
I don't recall at all, I'm afraid. I suspect I'd recently had a discussion with Norman about assessments for 8414, and he may well have mentioned it during that time. But unfortunately, I don't recall the circumstances now.
Okay. Now, the BBA certificate now, you've touched on that, and you've mentioned that there was a meeting with the BBA. So this is moving forward to January 2014. Can we look at your first witness statement now? BRE 405774, page 24. And I want to look at paragraph 104. So you're asked the question, let's just look at that first. You asked, were you aware of any such meetings taking place at the BRE? Did you seek, or were you aware of any other employee of the BRE seeking advice in respect of the use of combustible materials on buildings over 18 metres or on the relevant sections of the building regulations and associated guidance? And you say at 104, I'm not aware of any meetings taking place at BRE specifically regarding the suitability for use of either K15 or RS 5000 on buildings over 18 metres in height or on the relevant sections of the building regulations and associated guidance. Now, I appreciate you say that there weren't meetings specifically regarding those issues, but were you present at, or were you aware of any meetings within the BRE which might not have had as their specific intended subject the suitability for use of K15 on buildings over 18 metres, but during that meeting, that subject was nonetheless discussed?
No, I think if I can just sort of put this in context, to say that the suitability of Kingspan or RS 5000, I think I'd probably say later on or earlier on in my statement that we can't single out a component such as the insulation in such a way. It is a system test, so I think that's really what I mean there. There's nothing to say that K15 or RS 5000 isn't suitable for buildings over 18 metres, as long as they're used within a system that suitably, has suitable protection.
Yes, I understand that, but we've been over some emails which would tend to suggest that the use of K15 over 18 metres must have been the subject of discussion. I think you've already accepted that it was from time to time, yes? And then if we can look at what paragraph 105 that follows on from that. You say this, you say, however, I am aware of discussions with the BBA regarding certain approvals, which the BBA had granted on the basis of the BS 8414 test standard, which we considered to be a non-standard cladding system, which incorporated K15. If I recall correctly, Dr. Sarah Colwell of BRE was involved in these discussions. And you've mentioned these discussions with the BBA. Now, at the end of the second line, there, so you say you're aware of discussions regarding the BBA and the approval they granted, and you refer to the we, you say which we considered to be a non-standard cladding system. Who's the we that you're referring to there?
That's myself and Sarah Colwell. Dr. Sarah Colwell.
And what about Stephen Howard?
Excuse me. Well, I understood that Stephen Howard was also under the same similar thoughts, but obviously I've seen his recent evidence and may have misunderstood his thoughts.
Right. And then if we can look at the next page and pick it up at 107 of your witness statement. You're asked to describe any interaction you had or were aware of with the BBA in respect of either the certification of Kingspan K15 or RS 5000. And the answer you give at 107, you say, as mentioned in my answer to question 8C above, we just looked at that. I am aware of some discussions between the BRE and the BBA regarding our concern over a particular BBA approval, which appeared to allow the use of Kingspan K15 on external cladding systems, which was based on a test which we considered was not typical of a standard system installation. However, I cannot recall the full details of these communications, nor have I seen any records or documents regarding these communications. Now, just taking it step by step, what can you remember about these communications with the BBA about the BRE's concerns over K15?
Well, I think our concerns were that, as I say there, one, that their certification was based on what we considered was a non-standard system, and two, that their certification was for K15 insulation, not a system. So the inference from our understanding of the inference of their certificate was that K15 could be used in a number of different types of system over 18 metres.
Yes, and that was not your view, was it?
No, that's not our view.
Yeah, and again, where you're referring to the we here, is that again, it's Sarah Colwell for sure, yes?
Yes, yes.
And can you remember whether Stephen Howard had similar concerns about the BBA certificate for K15?
I can't say whether he did or not, I don't know.
And was the concern about the BBA certificate, which was current in 2014, does that help you in terms of the timing of this? We'll come to look at that certificate in just a moment.
No, that doesn't really help, to be quite honest.
Okay. Okay. And can you recall how had this concern arisen? How had the BRE become alerted to a problem with the BBA certificate?
I don't know how it originated, to be honest. I think it was Sarah that originally brought it up, but who originally spoke to her about it, or whether it's something she just became aware of, I don't recall.
Yeah. And you referred earlier to the fact that you thought there was in fact a meeting with the BBA, between the BRE and the BBA, is that right?
I believe there was, yes.
Yes. Were you present at that meeting?
No, I think it was just Sarah Colwell and somebody from the BBA.
And can you help us as to, even in rough terms, when that took place?
I'm afraid not, no. As I say, I've not seen any formal documentation or anything relating to that. It's just discussions that we had in-house, and I understood that Sarah had actually spoken to somebody at the BBA. I don't even know who that was at the time. And
was it your understanding that Sarah Colwell had shared with the BBA the view that the test carried out in May 2005 was on a non-standard cladding system?
I think she just discussed with them our general concerns. I'm sure that that came up as well in terms of our thoughts on the system that was tested, but also that the certification as written inferred that K15 could be used in a number of different systems.
Yes. Thank you. So just to be clear, you think she discussed the BRE's general concerns about that BBA certificate, but also the fact that that 2005 test had been on a non-standard system, yes?
I can only say definitely it's the general concerns. I can't say definitely she discussed that specific test.
Yeah. Now, you said in that paragraph that you hadn't been able to find any records or documents relating to this. Can we just have a look at an email chain? BRE 403493. Sorry, and just while that's coming up, can you recall who it was at the BBA that Sarah Colwell spoke to?
No, I'm afraid not, no.
So this is an email without any text dated the 7th of January 2014 from Stephen Howard to you. And attached to it was the BBA certificate for K15. It was attached as a PDF. You can see that there in the attachments.
Yeah.
So it does appear that a specific certificate had given rise to particular concerns, yes?
Yes, it would appear to be, yeah.
And can you recall reading the BBA certificate?
Yes. I can't remember when, but I can remember reading it, yes.
Let's look at that attachment, BRE 403492. So this is the attachment that Mr. Howard sent you in January 2014. Does that help as to whether that looks like a certificate you would have read at some point about K15?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. And looking at page 1, if we look at the bottom left-hand side, we can see that it says the date of first issue was the 27th of October 2008. And then there's been an amendment in this much smaller text underneath. It says certificate amended 6th of April 2010. Can you see that?
Yes.
And then sticking with that page, that first page, you can see a bit further up under the capital letters, key factors assessed. We've got behaviour in relation to fire, which is the third bullet point down, or third point down. And it says this, it says, the boards will not contribute to the development stages of a fire. The product has been tested to BS 8414 Part 1, 2002 for one specific construction on masonry walls. Now, can you help us? When you read this certificate, what did you understand this phrase to mean? The boards will not contribute to the development stages of a fire.
To me, that sounds as if they're saying it's a non-combustible or limited combustibility board, which is not. So.
Exactly, that's my next question. That's not an accurate description of K15 in terms of its performance in fire, is it?
No, no.
And then if we go to section 7 on page 5, about 2/3 of the way down the page, we can see under 7.1, there it says, the product is classified as class 0 or low risk as defined in the documents supporting the national building regulations. And then it says this, the product therefore may be used in accordance with the provisions of, and for England and Wales, it says approved document B, paragraph 8.4, volume 1, and paragraphs 12.5, 12.6 and 12.7, volume 2. See also diagram 40. Now, just looking at that, did you consider that there were any circumstances in which K15 could be used in accordance with the provisions of paragraph 12.7 of ADB?
Only if it was tested within a system to the full requirements of BS 8414.
Well, just to help you, paragraph 12.7 of ADB is headed insulation, and it states that all insulation materials shall be of limited combustibility.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to have a quick look at that? Would that help?
Yeah, if we could, yeah.
Okay, let's go to CLG 1, 607 at page 96. There we have 12.7 of approved document B, and it's headed insulation materials / products. And it says in a building with a story 18 meters or more above ground level, any insulation product, filler material, etc., used in the external wall construction should be of limited combustibility. See Appendix A. This restriction does not apply to masonry cavity wall construction, which complies with diagram 34 in section 9. Now, just to put the the question again, did you consider that there were any circumstances in which K15 could be used in accordance with paragraph 12.7 there of ADB?
No, no.
Can you recall whether Sarah Colwell reported that she had discussed the specific language of the BBA certificate with the BBA itself?
Well, I think that was the general context of having those discussions with the BBA, is to discuss these sorts of issues that we felt were incorrect.
Yeah, yeah. Did you discuss any of this with Mr. Howard? We can see he sent you this certificate on the 7th of January 2014. Presumably there were some discussions after he sent it to you, is that right?
I think there must have been some discussion. I don't recall that particular circumstance. I don't recall why he sent it to me on that particular date. Obviously there's no text on there, so maybe I just said that I don't have a copy of the certificate to hand or anything, so he sent me a copy. So I guess from that we must have been having a discussion about it, but I don't recall the circumstances of that discussion.
Right. And you can't even recall whether it was a discussion about concerns that you or others in the BRE had about the content of that BBA certificate?
I'm afraid I can't recall. Clearly we've had concerns for some time in terms of the way the certificates are being represented, the installation performance is being represented in certificates, to put it in the correct way. So putting timelines and who those discussions were with and the context of those discussions, I'm afraid I really can't say.
Yeah. If we just look, just to complete what we have in the documents, if we can go to BRE 3015007. BRE 3015007. So all we have after that certificate sent is a message back from you to Mr. Howard, 7th of January 2014, on the same day, and you say, see attached, I assume this is the basis of the BBA certificate, and we can see you've attached a document with the number 220876, and that was the May 2005 test to BS 8414 part 1, yes?
Yes, yes.
And again, does that help you as to what you discussed with Mr. Howard?
No, I'm afraid it doesn't. No. Oh, clearly we were having a discussion around that, that particular certificate and the testing, but I don't recall specifically what those discussions were.
Right. Now let's move forward in time again now to August 2015. And if we can go to a series of emails at BRE 404085. Now this is quite a long chain and we won't go through all of it at this stage in the inquiry. But for now, I want to ask you about an email you sent to Phil Clark. If we can go to page 3, there's an email of the 6th of August 2015. About page 3, about halfway down the page. We can see, picking it up, there's an email from Andy Russell to you, 6th of August 2015 at 12:24. And the heading, the subject is BRE 135 certificate. And he says he says, hi Tony, another BS 8414 part 2 test inquiry. They're looking for a test of a Stene panel system. And then he gives some details of that system. SFS inner leaf, lined internally with plasterboard and not lined externally. Kingspan cool foam K15 insulation. cavity stene panel facade. And he says they need it pretty urgently as the handover is in September. Could you please provide a quote to him and a copy Geeta in as she's on holiday for the next 2 weeks? And then if we can go up to page 2, to the very end of the page, Mr. Clark responds and to you and to others on the 6th of August 2015. And if we look on the top of page 3, what he's saying, he says, gents, he says, the system looks like a usual build-up. The only unknown for me is the steni panel. I have a feeling we tested some similar and it got through. The main issue may be the hardened acrylic face and how that performs, as well as structural integrity of the panels. I would suggest that as this is again K15 and it appears that Kingspan systems are being heavily questioned by the NHBC, second in 2 days, and having spoken to Iva recently, there may be more to come, that it may be worthwhile asking Iva Meredith to see if we could utilise the Wall 1, which already has a partially built Kingspan SFS in system, sorry, steel frame system, I think that means, in place. If he agrees, this could be done by September. And then if we look up again, your response on the same day, the 6th of August, on page 2 at 1409, you say this, you say, back to Phil Clark and others, the same list. Thanks, Phil. Yes, I think the message is finally getting through that we can't assess everything based on one old test. Now, just to be clear, what exactly did you mean by that? The message is finally getting through. We can't assess everything based on one old test.
Well, we was getting a lot of requests for assessments for systems outside those that had been tested. So yeah, I think I'll just we're now getting people actually saying that they need a test as opposed to an assessment, because we were basically having to say turn around to people and say, no, we can't assess this based on that single test that has been done.
And are these desktop assessments that they're looking for?
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Yeah. And can you give us some indication of for how long had assessments been being requested based on only that one old test?
No, I don't know, to be honest.
But are we talking years? Are we talking months?
Probably years as opposed to months.
Yeah. And you say, yes, I think the message is finally getting through that you can't assess in that way. What had been done to try and get the message through that you weren't prepared to be doing that?
Well, I think probably just in terms that we're having to refuse to do these assessments.
And who was that message being communicated to?
Those that were asking.
Right.
I think in my first statement, I've mentioned a couple of occasions where Andy Russell has asked me my opinion on doing assessments for various different people, and in some cases my response is, I don't think we can do this.
Right.
So we were having to turn more away than we was actually enabling to do.
And was that communicated to Kingspan as well and to Mr. Meredith that was the situation?
Well, no, not necessarily, because the inquiries weren't coming from Kingspan. They were coming from other companies, be they designers or contractors or who else.
Yeah. And can we agree that by this time, by January 2014, you had a good awareness of the way in which Kingspan was using that one test from 2005 to market K15 and to achieve certifications for the product, yes?
Yes, we had a good understanding of how they were marketing it, yes.
Yeah. Now, Mr. Chairman, I note the time and I'm about to move to a new topic.
Would it be sensible to break there?
Yes, because I'm making good progress with this witness. So that would be a good moment for the lunchtime break.
Well, that's what we'll do. Well, Mr. Baker, we're going to have a break now so that we can all get some lunch. We'll resume, please, at 2:00. And once again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it over the break.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. See you later. 2:00, please.